This is the story of Californian Don Van Vliet, who reinvented himself as Captain Beefheart, and is for me the most important figure to emerge from the rock era of the 1960s and 1970s. I first saw Beefheart at the Whiskey A Go-Go in Hollywood in 1966, and I was spellbound. I heard echoes of his music in some of the records I listened to last week, and I'll hear more echoes in records that I listened to this week. Nevertheless, no one has ever sounded quite like him, although many believe that they have. Amongst those who admit to having been influenced by Beefheart are artists as diverse as Tom Waits, Beck and PJ Harvey. With no formal musical training, Don drilled a succession of bands into making matchless records, and some of the best of these were made with his childhood friend Frank Zappa. Those of us who regard him as possibly rock's only real genius just love him. Don is retired from music now and has resurfaced as a highly regarded and highly individual painter of the American landscape. Musician, painter, joke-teller, absent friend, Don Van Vliet's your man.
Well, I was born in the desert, came on up from New Orleans. Came upon a tornado, sun out in the sky. While we round all day with the moon sticking in my eye. Hey, 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 all you young girls, wherever you're at. I got a brand new Cadillac, got a Ferrari too. Yeah, sure enough, baby, sure enough, I got the time to teach you now, but you learn some too. I got the time to teach you now, but you learn some too. Yeah, sure enough, baby, sure enough, baby, I do.
Captain Beefheart is a man who was driven in pursuit of his musical vision to the borderline between imbalance and genius, particularly in his challenging and bizarre masterpiece, Trout Mask Replica. He's a composer who invented his own Dada-esque blend of blues, jazz, poetry and rock.
Hey, 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 all you young girls, whatever you do. Hey, 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 all you young girls, whatever you do.
A kind of psychedelic shaman who frequently bullied his musicians and sometimes alarmed his fans, Don somehow remained one of rock's great innocents. Unlike so many of his peers from the mad world of the 1960s underground, Captain Beefheart survived rock and roll. Today, however, he lives a virtual recluse, suffering from a long-term illness. Van Vliet has not been seen in public for several years and spends his time painting in his Northern Californian home. This is the story of one of rock's great mavericks, and it began in the quiet Los Angeles suburb of Glendale in 1941. As an only child whose grandparents lived next door, Don was always the centre of attention, and his artistic talents were indulged. He claims to have been sculpting since the age of 4. At the age of 13, he was offered an art scholarship to Europe, but instead his parents decided to move to the desert town of Mojave, a place that was to have an indelible effect on his imagination. Here, Van Vliet's creative talents found an outlet not through fine art, but through music, when he discovered the old blues masters.
He had dropped out of school by that time and spent most of his time staying at home. His girlfriend lived in the house, and his grandmother lived in the house, and his aunt and his uncle lived across the street. And his father had had a heart attack. His father drove a Helms bread truck, and part of the time Don was helping out by taking over the bread truck route and driving up to Mojave, and the rest of the time he would just sit at home and listen to rhythm and blues records and scream at his mother to get him a Pepsi. So I used to hang out over there after school. We'd eat the stale stuff that was left over from the bread truck, usually pineapple buns, and listen to R&B records till 3 o'clock in the morning.
It was around this time that Don had formed the Magic Band from local musicians and created the name Captain Beefheart in a jokey homage to his R&B heroes like Screaming Jay Hawkins.
Oh, somebody walking, babe. Oh, somebody walking my home. All I did was just want to love you, babe. Oh, that's why you do me wrong.
Don was a master at capturing the nuances of these blues artists and their vocal, and he could catch how Howling Wolf, the sound of Howling Wolf and Muddy Waters, and he could recreate. He didn't copy exactly, but he could recreate that sound. He had a tremendous blues voice, and basically we played a lot of those tunes back in the early days.
Oh, I'm gonna pack my clothes in the morning. Oh, I'm gonna hit the road, you know. Oh, I'm gonna pack my clothes in the morning. Oh, I'm gonna hit the road, you know. Somebody walking, baby, in my home, you know.
We played some incredible places like the Elks Lodge and even country and western bars. And you know, even in spite of the fact that we were different, once we played, I think that's why they call it, the name the Magic Band really stuck. Because no matter what we played it with conviction. We became local heroes amongst the community.
The growing teenage music market had record company scouts looking for an American blues band to compete with British bands like the Rolling Stones and the Animals. A&M Records thought they were signing such a product in Captain Beefheart.
Diddy Wah Diddy went down fairly well, but after that things took a turn for the worse. They had visions of us becoming a kind of like David Gates and Bread, you know, a pop band, which we were not. And their efforts into trying to make us a pop band as opposed to a blues band was a disaster.
Beefheart's first record deal followed what would become a familiar route, and it ended amid bad feeling and lawsuits. Meanwhile, Bob Krasnow at Buddha Records thought he'd make another attempt at turning Beefheart into Mick Jagger.
Oh, I'll be there, most any time of day. Call on me.
But while other young Californian musicians were creating the idyllic teenage landscape of the beach and the drag strip, Captain Beefheart was already heading in a new direction. Weaving a darker musical language from the desert and the wilder currents of the blues, the band moved to Los Angeles to record their first album, Safe as Milk.
Call on me.
Safe as Milk was already moving along pretty well when I got into the group, but Don started changing the arrangements. It was kind of, I would say, 70% there when we finally moved down to Hollywood. And we lived in Laurel Canyon. We rented a house in Laurel Canyon, and that's when Ry Cooder sort of entered the picture.
Work on the album was going slowly, so Bob Krasnow asked 20-year-old session musician Ry Cooder to help out.
So Krasnow called me up and said, it's going to be the biggest thing since the Beatles, bigger than the Beatles. It's going to be big, and I need your help. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? And they said, well, we need you to kind of get them ready for the recording. And boy, I said, okay.
By the time the album finally came out, a lot of those songs had evolved to become a little bit more avant-garde and a little bit more hinting of things to come in Don's later album. That was the transitional period. And that was when I left because of those influences. And I did not have that calling.
I said, look, I'm just here, you know, let's just see what you're doing. Well, I'll tell you what we're doing, what we're not doing. First goddamn thing is this goddamn guy here, points to Doug Moon again. Get out of here, Doug, just get out of here. No use to us now. You can't, I don't remember what language he used, but it was something like, you know, go away and let us do this. Another damn thing is, I'll sure tell you, you know, the bass player here, Jerry, like, he just can't, you know, he doesn't remember the parts half the time. I told him, I taught him the music. You know, I'm going, whoa, well, all right, one thing at a time. Next thing, Doug comes out with a loaded crossbow in his hand. Don't nobody move. He's got this loaded machine crossbow. I'm down behind the amplifier, man. I don't want to see no, you know, machine crossbow arrows coming at me. Oh, get that fucking thing out of here. Get out of here. Go back in your room. Okay. And off he goes. I'm saying, whoa, you know, uh-oh.
It didn't work with me at all. When it got a little bit too far out, a little too weird, unsyncopated, and bizarre, and avant-garde, that it just didn't work with me at that point.
Go back 10 years ago, sunbeams dance around. Go back 10 years ago, sunbeams dancing down.
The music had certainly left its down-to-earth blues cover version days, but it had become stronger, more distinctive, and yet was still accessible.
Autumn's Child, oh, they were great. Autumn's Child was the one that got me because it had a little 4/4 time. See, he didn't ever want to, he had a couple of ideas. One thing was if you sustain a groove for too long, it's corny. And that was bourgeois, and he didn't want to do that. You know, like getting a thing happening where you were actually in a tempo like 4. So somehow the concept seemed to be you take the raw blues elements, like the sound of the John Lee Hooker idea, the Howlin' Wolf, down to its purest element, which is just sound, a grunt maybe, you know, and something abstract. And then you take your John Coltrane, crazy time signature, free jazz, Ornette Coleman thing, and sort of hybridize them together. And this is what you come up with. Well, it's a great idea. Just to make those tunes work was a heck of a job of work, you know, it was not easy. Certainly none of it was written out, and certainly none of it was too well understood, but that's part of the appeal.
Singing through you to me, thunderbolts caught easily, shouts the truth peacefully. Cowboy sing black, breathe our roll electricity.
The record company had big plans for the band, and Ry Cooder joined them for a warm-up date a week before their possible big break at the Monterey Pop Festival, the festival that did great things for the careers of Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and even Otis Redding. This did not take into account Don's sometimes rather complicated behaviour.
Don had been, prior to this, and even during the recording of the album, Don had been having anxiety attacks, and he'd have to go to the hospital, and he'd drive himself there thinking he was having a heart attack because he didn't want anyone else to drive his car.
I think I'm having a heart attack. Chest pain. Stop the car. You pull the car over, and I'm going, yeah, right. Go over and getting really like freaking out, you know, sweating and breathing hard. I said, oh my God, you know.
And they'd tell him that, well, you're hyperventilating, you're having an anxiety attack, and you should just take some tranquilizers and you'll be fine. We have this set together. We're going to play about 35 to 40 minutes. Just a rehearsal for the Monterey Pop Festival. No big deal, no press, no heavy critics in the audience. Just a bunch of kids having a love in and us getting a chance to kind of test flight our set and make sure it works okay. And we start electricity. And Don comes out, you know, beams out with this electricity, and he's pointing out to the audience, and suddenly he just stops, and we start playing the song, and he's just kind of standing there. And he turned around, very composed, sort of straightening his tie, and walked off the back of a 10-foot stage and landed on the manager.
And we continued on instrumentally. Nobody cared. Everybody's, you know, out anyway. Audience is there for a good time. They don't give a shit. Got in the rent-a-car, drove back to the town, got on the plane, came home, and that was it.
And I tried to talk him out. I was walking across this lawn. I was going, Ry, please give him one more chance. We've got the Monterey Pop Festival. Can't you just stay another week? No, can't do it. Can't do it. Can't work with this man. Got in the car and left. So that was sort of the end of the commercial thing.
And the thing with Beefheart was so horrendous that it just like, you know, it would kill you to be stuck in a thing like that. And I figured if I didn't get out of town, it would kill me.
Light out, speaking straight ahead across the blank sea of the free, seeking
I won't just man who cool mind to bring the light to those who need to hide. I'm the shadow dealer. I'm the shadow dealer. I won't just man who cool mind to bring the light to those who need to hide. I'm the shadow dealer. I'm the shadow dealer.
Yet despite these hiccups, Beefheart and the Magic Band were becoming a powerful, if less commercial, unit. Beefheart had always been distinctive, but now in step with the times, he became authentically strange.
Beetle bones and smoke and stones, the dry sands fall, the strawberry mouth, strawberry moth,
strawberry caterpillar,
strawberry butterfly, strawberry fields, long winged eagles slither along the heels of today's children. Strawberry fields forever.
Captain Beefheart fans were the people who had even been rejected by the hippies, the people who were too weird for the hippies. In fact, Captain Beefheart and the Magic Band came and played in Portland, Oregon, my hometown, in 1970. They played at the Paramount Theater, gigantic theater. All 75 of the weirdest of the weirdos of Portland, Oregon showed up. There's one guy that had a helmet on with a light bulb that went on and off on his head, you know, and we all thought we were weird. Everybody tried to dress weird and, you know, all that stuff. We went in, we sat there, you know, we filled up the first 3 rows of the theater, and the lights dimmed, and Ed Marimba came out, one of the drummers, and he stood there in this long cape, and of course he looked weirder than any of us in the crowd, and he held out a little toy children's ray gun, and he pulled the trigger, and he went vzz, 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 as he said, ray gun, vzz, vzz. Ronnie Reagan. Vzz, vzz. And then he went over and sat at the drum set, and Drumbo came out on the other side of the stage, and they did this big drum duet, and then the whole band came out and completely blew us away.
A squid eating dough in a polyethylene bag is fast and bulbous. Got me?
Like the Beatles and the Beach Boys around the same time, Captain Beefheart now embarked on his most ambitious and complex work, Trout Mask Replica.
Ooh, light on Vermont, affected everybody, even Mrs. Wooden Welles.
In this house, the band spent 8 grueling months learning difficult parts under somewhat trying conditions.
Pistol showing and his little pistol toting.
There was no album contract in the beginning with Frank. Frank agreed to give Don total artistic freedom if he came up with an album. There was no money being sent by Frank, and we were basically not eating too well. And it was kind of a very lean time. I remember almost a solid month of having nothing but a little tiny cup full of soybeans every day as my meal. That was my only meal. It was very sort of, I felt like one of those Eastern mystics.
Fast and bulbous. That's right, the mascara snake. Fast and bulbous. Also, a tin teardrop. Bulbous also tapered. That's right.
I used to hang out with those guys. I lived in Woodland Hills, and so did Don. Had the house in Woodland Hills with the Magic Band that was doing the album. And it was pretty strange. Those guys weren't allowed to leave the house. Once a week, one guy, member of the band, got to leave to go get groceries. And they were in that house for, I think, about 8 months, rehearsing Trout Mask Replica.
This was a transition because musically, this is probably the most important point to make, is this is where Don got a piano. So everything was written on piano, so I started writing the music down, which limited Don because he couldn't play endlessly for hours. You just have to play one little thing. Give me enough time to write it down. He'd have to play it a few times so I could get it right. And then my assignment was to take these parts and give them to the right players. And at first he kind of told me, like, this is the bass part. I think the first thing he wrote was Dalley's Car. But he'd tell me, this is the bass part, this is the guitar, this is the other guitar. And after a while he just stopped doing that. And I'd say, well, who do you want to play what? And he'd say, well, you know what to do.
I've written every drum bit I've ever done, every note. I play the drums. I play the guitar. I play the piano. I want it exactly the way I want it. Exactly. Any composer, I would think, would want it that way. And I don't deviate at all. Don't you think that somebody like Stravinsky, for instance, don't you think that it would annoy him if somebody bent a note the wrong way?
Don tried to create an atmosphere where we were almost living this album. It was like we didn't have a private life. We were on stage anytime he was in the room. It was sort of like there was always a kind of a tension to where we had to be enthusiastic. We had to act as though we were really, excited about this, and that's hard to keep up for a year.
How do you teach these musicians to play your music?
Whip. A kind whip. No, I mean, a kind quip. No, a kind, how? A tape, with the piano, a tape. And it's very hard work, and they'll probably all leave after I say this, but they don't get enough money.
Beefheart used words like paint. What he wrote didn't always make literal sense, but thrown together in his playful manner, his phrases were interpreted as though they were Zen revelations. More than a conjurer of cute epithets, Beefheart was a verbal prankster.
Jeff's role was to read the poetry. Our role was kind of to be excited about hearing it. you know, hearing it dozens of times sometimes, you know. Pina, her little head clinking like a barrel of red velvet balls, streets filled her eyes, just on and on, you know, like, I can't hear this again.
Pina, her little head clinking like a barrel of red velvet balls, full pass noise. Treats filled her eyes, turning them yellow like enamel-coated tacks. Soft like butter, hard not to pour. Out enjoying the sun while sitting on a turned-on waffle iron. Smoke billowing up from between her legs made me vomit beautifully and crush a chandelier. Fall on my stomach and view her from 1,000 different facets.
You couldn't explain from a technical standpoint anything to Don. You couldn't tell him why things ought to be such and such a way. And it seemed to me that if he was going to create a unique object, that the easiest thing for me to do was keep my mouth shut as much as possible and just let him do whatever he wanted to do, whether I thought it was wrong or not. Like covering the cymbals and the drums with cardboard, and overdubbing his vocals with no earphones, hearing only vague leakage through the studio window, rendering him only slightly in sync with the actual track that he's singing on. That's the way he wanted it.
Well, that goes to show you what a moon can do.
I remember when they recorded the record, Frank had time booked in Whitney studio, and in 4.5 hours, the record was done. And Frank couldn't believe it. What do you mean done? Don said, the record's done, Frank. And it was. I mean, they basically went in there and they used that studio and did a live album. They had it so together, that much rehearsing, and it was, I think, the best album they ever did. Not the best. All the albums that Beefheart makes are the best. I love the man. I think Frank's good, but Beefheart's the real thing. If you want to get avant-garde, man, you're not going to find anybody that's going to get more avant-garde than Captain Beefheart.
I think that if he had been produced by any professional, famous producer, that there could have been a number of suicides involved.
I think we all kind of sensed that there was something going on here that had never been done before and was artistically sound. We knew that there was a market, there were people out there who were listening to things that weren't conventional. And I was excited about the fact that we were doing something that wasn't conventional. Even though sometimes I really wanted to be somewhere else, that's sort of what motivated me to stay.
I remember that I finished editing the album, it was on an Easter Sunday. And I called him up, I said, the album's done. And he made all the guys in the band get dressed up, and they came over here early in the morning and sat in this room and listened to it and loved it.
It was a double record set. It cost $7. It was too much, but Frank Zappa's name was on it, so I bought it. I took it home, I put it on. It was the worst dreck I'd ever heard in my life. I said, they're not even trying.
Now here she come walking, looking like a zoo. Hi, Ella Guru.
They're just playing randomly. And then I thought, but Frank Zappa produced it. Maybe I better get over another play. So I played it again, and I thought, it sounds horrible, but they mean it to sound this way.
She do what she mean and she do what she do. Got something for me, got something for you. She shows something.
And about the third or fourth time, it started to grow on me. And the fifth or sixth time, I loved it. And the seventh or eighth time, I thought it was the greatest album ever made, and I still do. It's the culmination of, for me, the entire history of the blues, rock and roll, experimental music, and free jazz, combined with extremely talented musicians playing it, and one of the most incredible voices in musical history, Captain Beefheart. I mean, he's a modern howlin' wolf.
Give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion. Don't give me no affliction. That old-time religion is good enough for me.
Good ain't enough for you.
Don followed this with a guest spot on Zappa's album Hot Rats, an album completely devoid of the musical turbulence paramount in his own work.
Standing on the porch of the Lido Hotel, bluesies in the lobby, love the way I sell. Hot beat, hot rats, hot cats, hot dicks.
By now, Captain Beefheart and the Magic Band had a strong underground reputation. For their next project, they made a TV commercial, although commercial is perhaps not the best way to describe it.
Wow, here's a meatball. Drop a reap.
In plain view, it's Captain Beefheart.
He made this weird black and white Dada video. And he got a local TV announcer to, you know, come and read it was very funny.
New on Reprieves, it's Lick My Decals Off Baby.
And they showed it a couple times on late night TV like local stations and got hate mail, got hate calls right away. Take that off. We hate that. See, people just couldn't take it. Now you would think nothing of it. You would assume it was a commercial for toothpaste. But in those days, nobody knew. And people were scared. You know, the guy had a vibe out there. You either loved it or hated it.
Captain, don't you want to make money?
Sure.
Then why don't you go commercial?
I think either I'm too smart or too dumb. I don't know which.
He decided at that point that the music was too far out. Now, this was a few years after he decided the music wasn't far enough out. So he wanted to go back to a simpler sound. And that was when we moved to Santa Cruz, California, and did an album called The Spotlight Kid. Started rehearsing for that.
There's my baby waving her handkerchief down. Now, yes, stand up when I hear that sound. This time it sounds like it's for kids. I get down on my knees with the gravel all around. Pray to the Lord.
After these extreme musical quests, the band settled down to become an extraordinary live act, performing their jagged and argumentative music. Where most bands were following the beat, the Magic Band hurtled all about it, while the captain pointed at the crowd and growled, whooped and yelled.
Ah, yeah! All the time crying. Maybe you had a girl like this. She always certain to go down to New Orleans.
We were in a setting where we had no money again and no food. We were getting welfare or food or surplus food or something. We'd have to go down and sign this paperwork and stand in these long lines and get cans of beans and a big thing of cheese and some Spam. And this is what we had to eat for a month.
And these were the good times, as the band achieved their biggest commercial successes. Yet Beefheart wasn't only creating music. Throughout his career as a musician, his output of drawings and paintings was prolific. He was never without a sketchbook, and his work found an outlet through his album covers.
Boy, got a boogie. Boy, got a boogie.
By the early 70s, Don began to exhibit his paintings and establish himself as a serious artist.
Why'd you paint?
Need exercise. Don't get that much exercise physically, being on the stage and whatnot. Just on the stage and sitting around waiting for this job and that job. So I exercise this way, exercise my arm.
Why are all the paintings in white, grey?
Because I think they leave more imagination to the person observing them, because I don't like colored television. I don't. I think that Kellogg's cornflakes and television are the same thing. colored. Black and white television, or gray and white, I think is more dramatic, more for the observer. They can put their own colors in. If somebody got mad and saw red, they could make a red background. That's it.
Beefheart, now under new management and on yet another label, made a more blatant attempt at commercial success. This alienated his regular band, disappointed his fans, and made music that was, by his standards, easy listening.
It was such a kick for us to have a record by Captain Beefheart on Virgin. We were a very new label, don't forget, at the time. My recollection was there were two brothers called DiMartino, although I believe only one of them was credited on the records. And they told us that they could license new Captain Beefheart and the Magic Band recordings, and that these were going to be more accessible than prior recordings. The records, musically, were disappointing, but even a bad Beefheart record was better than most of what was available, in our opinion.
The ditch was stacked, the wind blew low, the wind blew high. The stakes were low, the stakes were high, upon the mountain. Hands low, hands high, ho, 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 hi, hi, hi. Gotta make her move, gotta make her fly, upon the mountain. How was I to know she was so shy, upon the mountain? Across the light, across the night.
But neither the art world nor the music business brought him great financial reward, and he returned to live a modest life back in the Mojave.
I live in a trailer in the desert, up in the Mojave Desert, the high desert. And my neighbors are coyotes, rattlesnakes, ravens. And the desert is so subtle. I mean, if you really delve into how subtle it is, it's subtle. Too subtle to I don't know, it's hard to pay that much attention.
Beefheart's relationship with record companies and managers had reached yet another low, and again he found himself working with Zappa.
Don had the ability and the inclination to sign any piece of contractual paper shoved under his nose without comprehending what these papers said and how they interacted with each other. And so his career fell on evil days because he had signed papers with companies all over the place that all had conflicting claims on his services. And so he was in a position where he couldn't tour and he couldn't record. And it was at that time that I put him in the band to do the Bongo Fury tour. That was the only way he could make some money, because he was just legally tied up all over the place.
Of course, Frank would always say that. And Don might say, I did Frank a favor by going out and being the best lead singer he ever had.
Sam wasn't showing Scout Flat Top particular about the point it made. Why, when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, this black juice came out on a hard-shelled chin, and they called that tobacco juice.
When they hit El Paso, they weren't even speaking to each other by that time. Don was drawing too many pictures of Frank. He'd fill 3 of those big books that he carried around, the ones he likes to draw in. 3 books full of Frank, in all positions, as the devil, as everything. I saw some of the drawings. I thought they were pretty funny myself. Frank didn't think they were funny at all.
Music from the other side of the fence.
Don would sit on stage and just draw for most of the entire concert. he would just be drawing in his art books. And then every once in a while he'd turn around and show it to us. Gotcha, he would say.
Done. I wish I had a pair of bongos. Bongo Fury. Bongo Fury.
It's like two geniuses together, you know, and they're both on ego trips. You know what happens, you get two guys on that big of ego trips together. I'm surprised they survived the 1975 tour. Really amazed me that they did.
That was not easy, but, you know, it was only a few weeks.
Soon after, Beefheart was again signed to Virgin, who in a post-punk Europe proved to be the understanding record company that nurtured his return to form, even if sales continued to struggle.
After punk, there was a much more open-minded attitude to different musical forms. I don't think he was about to become Bruce Springsteen. I don't think he was suddenly going to make a record, or that the type of records he was making was suddenly going to reach much larger audiences. I never had that feeling at all.
I think this is the best batch yet.
We tried very much to make records that we thought were, in our opinion, great records without having any realistic expectation of them selling in vast quantities. And when I say we tried to make the records, it wasn't that we had any influence over the musical content. I wouldn't claim to have had any input musically at all into those records, other than trying to create an environment where Don could make the record he wanted to make.
Now playing with much younger musicians, his relationship with them was more avuncular. He's now seen less as a 60s weirdo and more as a wonderfully creative musician.
The process of the creation of the music is wonderful, and it's really stimulating, and it's, to me, I think, and for most people, that's kind of the reason you do it.
The song Bat Chain Puller just seemed like such a great composition. I know that the drum beat sort of came about from a rhythm that was windshield wipers on Don's car. It just, if you listen to the drum beat on that, it sounds just like windshield wipers.
Bat chain, bat chain puller.
There are ways of using the guitar in a kind of an angular way, very atypical in rock and roll. Very little distortion, very, very structured music, but a willingness to go over the top with improvisation underneath this very, very complicated structure. For some of us out there, this beat, the factory rhythm, the rhythm that we all march to, is very, very tedious. And one of the great things about Captain Beefheart's music is that it breaks this rhythm. It's ba-da-ba-ba-ba, ba-da-ba, you know, it does all that other stuff, and it gets away from that.
Rock and roll is a fixation that boom, 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 mama heartbeat. I don't like hypnotics. You see, I mean, I'm doing a non-hypnotic music to break up the catatonic state. And I think there is one right now. I just want to play. I mean, I want things to change, like the patterns and shadows that fall from the sun.
Come on down to the beat. Come on to the beat.
Ironically, it was during this late creative spell that he decided to leave the music business.
I always thought there would be probably one more tour. Finally, it felt to me, but I think that's the way that it always is. I think he just ducked out at just the right time.
The final album, Ice Cream for Crow, was amongst his very best, but an ageing Beefheart now had to face a choice between his respected but struggling career as a rock guru and his emerging reputation as a painter.
Ice cream for Crow. Ice cream by night, ice cream by day. The sun ain't stable.
He was then offered a deal with the prestigious Michael Werner Art Gallery.
Well, Michael Werner said, "You'll never be respected as an artist. You'll be a musician that paints. If you want to be a painter, you have to stop doing music."
Crow dance, a panther. Scarecrow, you answer.
Well, the artistic style would seem to have a relationship with abstract expressionism, and Don has spoken of Franz Klein and Willem de Kooning as artists that whose work he was familiar with. So I think the work has associations with mainstream abstract expressionist painting, but it is certainly not a manifestation of it that comes through an art school. And he is a self-taught artist, and the handling of the paint is not in any traditional technical way beautiful. It has that same kind of edge the music has.
Turn up the speakers. Hop, flop, squat. It's a keeper.
Now that's quite good, isn't it? For
Oh, ice cream for Crow. Now. That's it. Now you can go.
For most art critics to say that the abstract expressionist movement is one that instilled Don Van Vliet's work is in fact a mistake, because most of the abstract expressionists, Franz Klein, Jackson Pollock and so forth, were urban, town-dwelling people, and their work was built upon the anxieties and fractures in personality that dwelt from living in a high-octane urban environment. Don Van Vliet is a rural artist. He's a natural world artist, and he presents the natural world in a way that's much more peacefully motivated than any of the abstract expressionists that are said to motivate him. In that sense, he's one of the few people who are working out of landscape at the moment and trying to make something fresh for themselves. And that's why I think he's going to grow in importance.
He had a driver at that point. I noticed he wasn't driving himself. He liked cars. He had a Corvette and then he had a Jaguar. And so I took it as a sign when he wasn't driving it. I thought, that's curious, you know. So he seemed very fidgety and nervous and almost palsied, you know, and not well. So I thought, well, something's with this dude, you know. You move off in one direction, and I suppose he moved off and did whatever he did, but really never heard of him again until I heard that he was wheelchair bound or sick or doing painting, and I thought, oh yeah, he always liked to draw. You know, he had a nice flair.
I was on the stage for 15 years.
You liked being on the stage?
I did, yeah. Yeah, I did when I was there. Yeah,
Are you going to be going on tour now with...
No, that's why I did that video, actually. Because I would rather paint my time not to paint.
I do think he's happier being a painter. I meet a lot of people that say, is Don going to do music? Will Don do music again? And I hear that all the time. But I think he's doing the right thing. And then, you know, that's what I tell them. I think he's happy, you know, go look at his art. You know, he's still there. He's still creating just as much. He paints every day. I think at this point in Don's life, he's most happy just living at his house and and having a nice view of nature, being able to create, being able to just go create, not having to deal with the public so much, and having a private life.
Into the sun in my life. Yes, the shadow beside her. Up and down to the blue. Up and down to the blue. Clouds give me my silent and I'm up in my glider down, up in my glider with a shadow beside her. Turn a bit, get to rain on her window pane.